All right. Well, welcome one and all to our special session today of the bi-weekly meetings of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. This event will feature a distinguished panel discussing the topic of how to govern climate cooling interventions. My name is Janos Pasztor, newly elected coordinator of the HPAC Circle, and I will be moderating with backup from Herb Simmons, and who is also a steering circle member. Interest in cooling governance is accelerating, especially within the last year or so. This has undoubtedly been a response to seeing the average global temperatures now hovering at about 1.5 degrees C during the past year, thus essentially breaching the Paris Agreement target. Many years before all expectations that this would happen, while the pattern of climate disasters has been particularly devastating recently all around the world, and the recent science indicates that the planet may already be breaching a couple of potentially catastrophic Earth system tipping points. And all of this is happening while greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and rise year after year. The alarm bells are ringing louder and louder. A safe climate for humanity and our ecosystems is clearly in the rearview mirror and could get much worse. Thus, there are many calls for expanded research on climate cooling and for urgent governance consultations arising from various quarters around the world. Now, to remind us, the mission of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition is clear. We advocate that the world community urgently come together to carry out an equitable, science-based plan of action that includes what we call the climate triad: directly cooling the climate through sunshine reflection, ecosystems restoration, and other safe and effective means, accelerating emissions reduction, and third, deploying large-scale removal of atmospheric carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. The goal of these actions, along with enhanced and transformative adaptation and regeneration measures, is to reduce the average global temperature increase to well below 1 degree centigrade in the coming decades. Doing so will sharply reduce weather extremes, slow or stop the collapse of key ecosystems, and help ensure a livable planet for humanity and the natural world. Our special guests today are Mr. Janos Pasztor and Dr. Ted Parson. Janos Pasztor was most recently the executive director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. Before that, he served as UN Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change and senior advisor to the UN Secretary General. And earlier, he held various positions at the secretariat of the UNEP, United Nations framework for the Convention on Climate Change, and the World Wildlife International. Ted Parson is professor of environmental law and faculty director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has led and served on multiple advisory committees for the National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and other national and international bodies. His work was influential in establishing the World Commission on Climate Overshoot, for which he serves as a senior advisor. We're starting off the program by asking each of these gentlemen to share with us their current understanding of the governance landscape for direct climate interventions by addressing 3 questions in the context of the climate triad of emissions reduction, GHG removals, and climate cooling interventions. First, what are the most crucial needs for good governance in this domain? Second, what are the obstacles to making good governance happen? And perhaps most crucial, what are the most plausible or feasible governance mechanisms? To our audience, we request you to put your questions in the Q&A as we go through the session. Herb Simmons will be monitoring the Q&A to draw out your questions for presentation and discussion. And also, time permitting, we'll be opening up the floor for viewers to raise their hands and address their questions directly to our guests. So to launch the conversation, let me first turn to Janos to address the key questions. The floor is yours, Janos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to sharing a few thoughts with you. It's nice to see some old friends among the participants, and hopefully there might be some more after this discussion. We'll see. I think based on your introduction, Dennis, that there is no need to go into any details about the context of the climate crisis. I think we all know that we're in really bad shape. We also know that there are many actions that are kind of generally going in the good direction, but they're all going way too slowly. And of course, emission reductions has to be, and related sustainable development actions are the priority, but we went too far in polluting the atmosphere, and we have to do some, let's call it corrective actions. And the corrective actions are large-scale carbon dioxide removal and potentially solar radiation modification. And they're different than the sustainable development path, but unfortunately, had we done what we should have done 30, 40 years ago, we wouldn't be here where we are today, but we are here. So that's the context, and there are at least two reasons why we need to discuss SRM and its governance. One is the climate, and the other one is the lack of governance, which, according to the IPCC, is a risk by itself. And so I would like to share a few thoughts then based on the questions that have been asked. One more sort of general comment is that because we talk a lot about governance, this is not just governments regulating. Governance is something broader, very much like the IPCC definition of the whole of society, different stakeholders in society working toward agreed goals, or for that matter, against agreed goals. But it's the whole of society, different stakeholders in formal or informal manners. And it can, of course, governance can include very formal regulations, laws, international treaties, and etc. So it's in that context that I talk about governance. Now, the first question was the most crucial needs for good governance, and I would start with the governance of research. It is key because we need to, I strongly believe that we need to promote understanding of the risks and benefits and the governance challenges of climate change. And for that, we need to do research. We also need to address concerns. There are groups of scientists who want to develop a non-use agreement and related non-research for SRM. And that's also governance, and that also has to be treated one way or another. Now, there are these research governance can be very informal. Anybody who is doing research can set up with a friend some governance framework. It can be voluntary. It can be provided as guidelines by science bodies like the International Science Council or the Inter-Academic Council, or based on academic papers. There are quite a few that have been written on this. It can also be very formal from government science research policy, or funding allocation by governments, because if governments allocate funding, then that sort of creates a certain direction. The second most crucial one, in my view, is societal conversations. And that also can be done in a formal and informal way, but these are absolutely necessary to build trust in the science and to help the co-evolving governance mechanisms with the science. Without societal conversation in most societies, it will be difficult to achieve that. And that will be necessary for a good research governance mechanism, but also for eventually, because maybe not now yet, but for eventually for any kind of governance process that is developed to decide whether or not to deploy solar radiation modification. So that would be my first question. Second question is, what are the obstacles to making good governance happen? There are few, and maybe I would start with the uninformed, badly informed public, which kind of results in people being too polarized as for or against and labeled into those boxes of for and against, which I don't think is very helpful. Climate strategy is much more complex than just two simple boxes. Life is more complex, and SAI and other so complex and public. The second obstacle, I think, is that we don't really have too many what I would call society-wide conversations. There are some conversations taking place, increasingly so, but not yet reaching the wholes of societies. And we need conversations about the fact that the temperature overshoot is coming, and it's quite serious. We need a better conversation of what the impacts are and what are the options available. And maybe there are not too many, but we need to discuss what those options are to be clear why certain discussions may need to take place. Now, the outcome of this discussion does not necessarily mean that we end up having to deploy stratospheric aerosol injection. It may, but that's why I think it needs this kind of good evidence-based discussion. The third obstacle, I think, is that we don't have enough NGO civil society organizations that are engaged in this. There are a few. Some are working in an evidence-based mode, and some are working more in an ideology-based mode. And I think we need more evidence-based on either side of the divide, if there is such a thing, but we need more NGOs to engage. So with these kinds of points, what we have at the end is politicians are not concerned. They're not interested because there is no pressure from anywhere. And they have what I would call a pretty narrow climate policy, which to some extent has failed. They talk about keeping 1.5 alive. I'm not sure what that means. And in a sense, they're not talking about these important issues, which I have been labeling more recently Inconvenient Truth 2.0, if some of you remember the Al Gore film from 2006. At that time, the inconvenient truth was climate change itself. Now, I think the inconvenient truth is what it's going to cause to all of us. And if you haven't yet, read the article today in the New York Times by David Wallace Welch. I think it's very instructive. This is about Helena and the impacts and how people are not listening to what the issues are. So anyway, so all of that means that governments are simply not ready for serious discussions of the formal governance mechanisms at the international level. We've had attempts at UNEA, but they haven't, at the UN Environment Assembly, they haven't succeeded. No real effort at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change yet. The IPCC has done a lot of good scientific assessments, but the messages tend to get lost by the time they get to the summaries for policy makers. So this is sort of the obstacle. And then the third question, plausible governance, feasible governance mechanisms. I think I would start by self-governance because that's the most plausible one, by researchers, by for-profit or non-profit startups. There are a few of those, and I've had the opportunity to be involved in one of them. There are examples of, let's say, good and bad self-governance out there. Let's not go into the details. Maybe in the discussion we can. But the fact is that they exist. And I think that's number one. I would say that the conversations that I very much lack are beginning to happen. There is more and more of this, and that's a good sign. There's much more media, partly because as the climate gets worse by the day, media, of course, cover that. And also when strange activities take place, and I'm thinking of Make Sunsets without necessarily being so critical, but just simply to say that when those activities take place, then the media also listen, and also some people also listen. So that results in more conversations. We saw at the Climate Week in New York last week, I was there, and there were definitely more discussions about geoengineering, about solar radiation modification than any time before. And that is true also for the side events of the UNFCCC, even though in the formal discussions, there is no place for these at this point. I also think that the UN Environment Assembly will eventually get to having a resolution. I think partly because we have now a UNEP executive director who understands this issue, and he understands why governments need to do something here. The UNEP expert group that was convened, which resulted in the One Atmosphere report, has been generally welcome, and it shows sort of the way forward. And UNEP is in any case going to keep this under review. And the governments, there are many governments who are clearly want to bring this back to UNEP again. I think IPCC, there is lots of good peer-reviewed material that they will have to assess in the seventh assessment process. Let's hope that the conclusions will not be lost in the summaries for policymakers. I think the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, I think it's important to bring it into that process at some point, because climate policy has to have some kind of governance frame that brings emission reductions, carbon removal, adaptation, building resilience, and albedo management together in one common framework. That's, I think, one of the reasons why there is an F in the UNFCCC. It's not a four-letter word, it's a many-letter word, it's framework. And to bring these different items together. It is challenging to bring this into the UNFCCC. It will take time, but I think eventually it will be necessary. I would like to make two more comments on feasible governance mechanisms. I think it's possible to also arrive at governance through, let's call it, benevolent unilateral action. Benevolent in the sense that there may be unilateral action that brings other actors, other governments along in some kind of governance process ex post or during or after the announcement of going forward in a unilateral way. But I'm not saying that's a good way, but it is potentially a way that things might happen in our world. The final point is, some people have said we can't wait for full governance. It will take a long time. It probably is true that it will take a long time. But the challenge I see that if without governance, even simple experiments get stopped through various societal coalitions. So we've seen what happened with SCOPEX, with the marine cloud brightening experiment Almeida, and probably more to come. So without governance, it's very difficult to proceed. It's like a vicious circle. And I believe that we have to define different ways to move forward on this. So I'll stop here just to conclude that it's going to get hotter. The world is not ready for it. Our leaders are not talking about it, neither government nor NGO and nor in academia too much. I already referred to this article today in the New York Times. I strongly recommend it. It's very important. How to change this? I think on the one hand, we can wait until even more catastrophic impacts happen every day and then scramble to do something, like the sort of Ministry of the Future scenario where 20 million people die in India and then India unilaterally starts stratospheric aerosol injection. That's one scenario. Or we can try to engage different sectors in society with lots of energy and lots of time to better understand these issues, to discuss the issues, and come up with evidence-based views, and then push the leaders to seriously research these issues so we better understand them, and put in motion governance processes that can eventually decide. And the eventual doesn't have to be 20 years from now or 50 years from now. It can be next year, but it has to happen at some point, whether or not to deploy stratospheric aerosol injection, and very importantly, how to deal with the implications of either the yes or the no, because in either case, there will be important implications. Now, I don't think that having to rely on stratospheric aerosol injection is a given. I don't think it's true as yet, but if we're not careful, we will soon end up in this dead-end street when this is the only option that remains. So I hope that our conversation today will help moving not in that direction where that's the only option, but to find really good evidence-based ways to figure out what are the best ways to move forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Janos. A couple of points really struck me. The fact that initiatives by individual governments could bring together initially a coalition of willing countries to begin developing these frameworks and then draw others in. Seems like a very logical way in which we may proceed while we look for more broader approaches to governance. And certainly we'll want to bring yours and Ted's observations along with us in terms of what the Healthy Planet Action Coalition can do in terms of bringing together people for these kinds of conversations, bringing together ideas, programs, proposals that can take us forward. And we're doing a lot of discussion right now, for example, on influencing governments like the United States Congress, working with governments in countries like India, the Philippines, and others. And so there's a lot that you could advise us in terms of going forward on this as we want to do. Right. Well, now, thank you again, Janos, and we'll turn to Dr. Ted Parson to address his observations on the key questions, and then we'll have our first segment of Q&A. And remember to drop your Q&A into the Q&A box on Zoom, and Herb will be working with us to monitor the questions. So, Ted, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to see you. Janos, it's great to see you again. It's been so long. Janos and I saw each other within the past week in New York. So on your four questions, we're speaking principally about solar geoengineering, or SRM, or perhaps principally about stratospheric aerosols within that class, although there's heterogeneous things with this SRM, and then SRM is one response. If you think at the highest conceptual level about the four possible ways of intervening in the entire causal chain that goes from people living their lives and pursuing their livelihoods through to harmful climate impacts, you have mitigation to cut emissions, so to let society continue with prosperity and people having good lives, but with less burden driving climate change. You have removals of old emissions from the atmosphere in order to break the linkage between emissions and concentrations. You have solar geoengineering to break the causal linkage between the current state of the atmosphere and the resultant radiative imbalance and climate change. And then you had adaptation to break the causal linkage between the climate changing and harm to people and things they care about. And now, with a group this sophisticated, obviously you're all aware of these four things. I think it's just interesting in noting these four options in both conceptual and historical context, because each of them has come to prominence and respectability at a different time. Now, although there's this oddity that if you go back to the 1950s and the 60s, when a few scientists were thinking ahead to global climate change, and indeed the first scientific report came to a United States president in 1965, there's this oddity that this scientific report was actually pretty good. I mean, there's been a ton of change since there, but in terms of basic mechanisms, it was understood even then. But when they got to responses, the only response option considered in that report was modifying the Earth's albedo, because the notion of cutting emissions or cutting fossil fuels was beyond the pale. It was outside the capacity to imagine. You have some of you, maybe I'm guessing some of you are old enough to remember the energy crisis of 1973 and the fact, hi, Mike, great to see you. And the fact that up until that point, there was a widespread respectable belief that prosperity and energy consumption, AKA fossil fuel use, had to proceed in lockstep. There was no possibility of separating those. Well, we got past that. But the point I want to make here is that so when climate change came to policy prominence in the 80s, mid to late 80s, the set of options considered rapidly converge on cutting emissions as the only respectable thing to consider. There's pragmatic and tactical reasons that makes sense. It's a little weird that the prior conversation about active interventions completely disappeared. But the important point here is that each subsequent step had to be dragged into the debate kicking and screaming. So I don't know how many of you remember Al Gore's first book on climate change, not The Inconvenient Truth, but Earth in the Balance, which had a long chapter denouncing people who were thinking about the importance of adaptation as a climate response, because talking about the possibility of adaptation would be an unhelpful distraction from the essential task of cutting emissions and assault to the fossil enterprises and their shale organizations. Because so remembering that debate is instructive in thinking about the subsequent expansions of the choice set. So roughly speaking, adaptation had to get dragged into prominence and respectability, and that happened in the 90s. Large-scale removals had to get dragged into prominence and respectability, and that happened in sort of the late aughts. And we're now at the point, or the threshold, where the same process with the same conflicts and arguments is happening for solar geoengineering. And the biggest concern remains the same one that was advanced previously. Obviously, there's concerns that are specific to this type of intervention. Will it really work? Will it work in a way that conveys benefits and costs in a just way globally? How well do we know? Is the research well established? What will the side effects be? All totally legitimate questions and researchable questions. But the gut punch resistance that people feel to it is mainly about the sense that the only virtuous and proper response is cutting emissions, because that's the only one that's like going to the cause that is somehow virtuous. Now, we don't have time to go into the sort of the normative foundations and the logic of those arguments and the sociology. It's actually very interesting that the locus of people's attention and concern gets shifted from the problem to assigning virtue to one response per se. But that's kind of where we are, and that is one of the barriers. I'm jumping ahead of myself and answering your questions, Dennis, because I'm actually getting to obstacles before I'm getting to crucial needs. So let me try to reframe this and address your questions in order. Most crucial needs: one, a reasoned evidence-based consideration of the entire suite of responses available to reduce human and ecological harms associated with climate change without a priori categorical, ideological, or religious bases for saying one of these is good and the others are less good. This is not an exhortation to say they're all good. You have to look at the details, and you have to consider the magnitude, character, and distribution of costs and benefits of specific interventions. I mean, you have to engage in some sort of reasoned, fair-minded weighing of evidence for each of them. But if it is not proper, if it ever was proper, to a priori categorically exclude some of these from consideration based upon who likes them, their symbolic or aesthetic or ideological resonance, misplaced notions of what's natural and what isn't natural, and inappropriately assigning normative value to that. I mean, geez, I thought we solved that philosophic problem in the early 19th. I thought David Hume and John Stuart Mill basically dealt with that. And why do we have to keep, it's not just we have to keep fighting the same arguments as we did 10, 20 years ago. Why do we have to keep fighting the same arguments as we did 200 years ago? Okay, so first need is a reasoned evidence-based willingness to consider any response based upon whether and how well it works, with an appropriate consideration of the multivariate distribution of types of benefit and cost and their distribution across people, with particular attention to justice considerations and also over time. Two, rapid pursuit with a seriousness not yet marshaled of those response pieces that we really have strong basis to know are effective, essential, relatively benign. It's like, please cut emissions. Please enact effective policies and measures at all jurisdictional levels to cut emissions. Please seriously invest in known, effective, and relatively benign and long-term stable methods of removing past emissions from the atmosphere. Please invest seriously in adaptation without it getting sort of twisted or hijacked to be whatever you wanted to do already anyway, and actually have a focus on reducing vulnerability to climate change. Okay, so I've given you sort of two priors before my list of most crucial governance needs. So now I'll get to after the priors. One, research, assessment, and public communication. There are dozens of proposed options within the space of atmospheric removals, and there are dozens of proposed options within the proposed space of solar geoengineering, or SRM, each with their enthusiasts, their associated commercial and professional and scientific interests, and they're not all equally promising in terms of state of knowledge regarding effectiveness, feasibility, technological maturity, costs and benefits, etc. So there is a very serious research exercise that actually is required. Maybe it's no longer before you start trying to do stuff, because we've waited so long to do stuff we should have done already, but at least it's right in phase with the earliest stages of trying to do stuff. Because an evidence-based inquiry into different methods is not going to, it's not going to distribute a prize to everyone and to everything. There is a real need to consider relative efficacy, timelines, technological maturity, and side effects. There's a need to do that as a research exercise. There's a need to do that in parallel as an assessment exercise, where assessment is not the same thing as research. It's the assimilation and interpretation of results of research in terms that are relevant for policy and other public decision-making. And there's a parallel, absolutely essential exercise of clear, trustworthy, effectively disseminated public communication. As part of that exercise, there needs to be honest, candid, and trustworthy communication about the strongest substantive bases that people and organizations have advanced for concern about the pursuit of SRM, or solar geoengineering, options. Although I'm quite strongly of the view that many of the arguments advanced against consideration of SRM are made disingenuously and in bad faith, not all of the underlying normative concerns. Many of the underlying normative concerns are actually valid and serious and need to be treated as such, and need to be engaged explicitly and respectfully. You know, I agreed with everything Janos said, with one possible exception. And the possible exception actually depends upon terminology, because it depends upon what we each mean by governance of research. So I would not normally tend to put governance of research as an initial zeroth order step for effective governance of SRM and related options. Maybe I'm a little jumpy on that, because I have observed the degree to which arguments over governance of research have been confused and confounded, with many claims about needs for governance of research being proxies for demands to prohibit or starve research. Research is a public collective enterprise that has sometimes social effects in addition to the knowledge generated, and that often draws on public resources. And so there's a kind of there's a sort of a minimal core of functions where all research is governed and must be governed. And there is research that risks doing real harm, for which the most prominent historical example is human subjects research in medical research, on which, in response to a set of egregious, profound injustices that were perpetrated on vulnerable research subjects in the mid-20th century, there has been established a special regime for governance of research with explicit focus on consideration of benefit and risk to people and communities, because it's broadened beyond just medical research on individuals who are involved in the research. As a rule, though, we do not have governance of research by subject matter based upon concerns about indirect effects of the research that might follow from misuse of the resultant knowledge or capability. So research areas of the form, if you pursue this research, people will think this incorrect thing, and people will do these bad actions, and it will lead to these bad outcomes. As a rule, societally, we have, I normally try to avoid the rhetorical collective we because of its ambiguity and its presumption of, universal agreement. But I'm going to fall into the trap I tell my students not to because it's efficient. So I'm going to use the word we, but put an asterisk beside each one. Usually, we don't regulate research or govern research by subject matter based upon concerns about misuse of the resultant knowledge or capability. The only exceptions are instances where the causal pathway toward people doing very bad things with the resultant knowledge and capability is so direct and immediate and obvious that the case is totally compelling. So we don't let people do nuclear weapons or biological weapons research, right? We govern that out of reasonable concern that the knowledge or the capability could in very obvious and direct ways be misused. But we don't, as a rule, restrict or govern research because we think policymakers will be confused or ignorant citizens will be confused and vote for bad policymakers, and so people will do bad things based upon misinterpreting the result of this research. And so, Janos, I'm trying to, I don't want to be unfair to you because you have never endorsed this, but you have spoken about the need for governance of research in a way that it sometimes strikes me admits the possibility of that governance being more expansive and requiring a broader scope of prior consent by all actors who claim standing than I think is has historical parallels or is fully justified. Now, there's other ways that you might use the term governance of research where I think we agree entirely, because in a sense, the provision of public resources to support research is a governance function, right? Governance is enabling as well as restrictive. And when you're providing public resources to support scientific research, the public has a legitimate claim to know something about how it's being done, etc. Okay, so there's a boundary there that is probably not a serious area of disagreement, but where the ambiguity of terminology has allowed people to advocate the same thing. Governance of SRM research is necessary before research programs are established, where some of them mean there should be good peer review and accountability for public resources and careful attention to environment, health, and safety impacts of any experiments done. And I guess transparency and disclosure about what you're doing are a really good idea, both to advance other research and to assure public concerns. To the other extreme of the debate, where governance of research is construed as meaning prior binding universal international authority to say who can do what using what methods with a sort of a strong presumption of restrictiveness. Okay. God, that was my answer to most crucial needs. I went on a long meandering ramble. I apologize for the disorganization. Let me try to pull it back here and be disciplined and address your questions. The key obstacles. Single biggest obstacle to the kind of serious consideration and pursuit of research and assessment on geoengineering options and also on some CDR options is widespread misunderstanding of the severity and imminence of the risks of climate change, and in particular, an exaggerated sense of the ease, cheapness, immediacy, or even feasibility of limiting near-term climate risk by cutting emissions alone. So, in a sense, the many things that are said around the boundaries of the IPCC and especially the FCCC are not helpful in this regard. The enthusiasm, the desperate enthusiasm to continue to defend claims of the form Paris is not dead, we can still meet the Paris targets, is unhelpful. And the people advancing supposedly technical claims about the rapidity, cheapness, and ease with which we can meet the world's energy needs with nothing but, solar, wind, and maybe a little bit of hydro is unhelpful. The boundaries of what's socially, politically, and technically feasible are diffuse. Societies are capable of doing things under conditions of consensually perceived extreme need that seem astonishing relative to normal political conditions. So you have to be really careful about making claims of infeasibility when you're speaking in the space of collective social and political action, as opposed to speaking in the space of technical feasibility or, conformity with known laws of physics and chemistry. But I want to say, staying below 1.5 with no overshoot by cutting emissions alone, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that's impossible. It wasn't impossible when I started working on climate change in 1990 or 1985. I forget, it's so long ago. But we didn't do that. There were a whole bunch of relatively cheap and relatively easy and certainly feasible opportunities available to kind of steer the supertanker away from the current energy economy that were available in the 90s and the aughts, and that sort of faded over time. And so many desirable avenues have passed out of reach. Gradually, you can't say exactly at what moment they get out of reach, but it's like they're pretty much out of reach now. So to argue that 1.5, or I think even 2.0, is technically, socially, politically feasible now through mitigation alone, I think is optimistic to the point of irresponsibility. And I think a great deal of the opposition to the kind of serious consideration of other responses that I'm advocating and that you folks are totally on board with, that's why you exist as an organization, they have to be considered, but the opposition to considering them reflects a substantial amount of misunderstanding and delusion about the severity of risks and the feasibility of mitigating them in the near term via other options. Second obstacle, the perfect as the enemy of the good, or the tyranny of the status quo. You can't do this, you can't even research this without demonstrating to me in advance that it can be done effectively, safely, justly, and well governed. I'm not a lawyer, but now I'm a law professor. Weirdly enough, I sit in a law school, so I've learned to listen and understand to some degree how they argue. We call that a burden shifting exercise. It's not it's not a position based on reasoned argument or evidence. It's a maneuvering of the prior playing field to say to the person on the other side, you're the one who has to show that what you're talking about doing is okay. I don't have to show that what I'm talking about, what I'm doing, okay. I had a wonderful colleague when I was at the Kennedy School who worked on empirical studies of social welfare policy. And so he did sort of large and empirical studies. It's like, what happens if you change health insurance in this way, or if you change the terms or conditions of income assistance support for different groups of people in this way? He had a wonderful saying about, the interaction between scientific research and policy in those areas, which is whoever owns the null hypothesis wins. Whoever owns the null hypothesis wins. In law schools, they say whoever has the burden of proof loses. Now, those are roughly equivalent. They're not always the case, but they're both powerful, slightly comedic, slightly cynical statements about the tyranny of the way things are done now. Of course, the way things are done now has millions of dimensions, and it's not possible to keep them all the same. And so anytime you get into such an argument, it's a rhetorical exercise of saying, no, what you're proposing is a radical departure from past practice. And so you're the one who has to prove to me that it's safe and effective and just. Okay. Perfect as the enemy of the good is part of a burden shifting exercise. Third big obstacle, the generalized weakening of public capacity, resource and authority starvation of public institutions, especially but not exclusively at the international level, and the associated mistrust and disparagement of any action or authority or capability that would be committed to the advancing the public, the collective welfare. even at the national level, we're at the end of 30 or 40 years of sort of rhetorical undermining of the collective interest and institutions to advance the collective interest. I just can't find a way of thinking my way through climate change or effective governance of geoengineering that doesn't involve vesting some authority at some point in institutions that are charged with acting in the public interest at whatever the relevant level of defining the public is, based upon evidence. Okay.
Ted,
those are the most crucial needs. Those are the obstacles. Most followable mechanisms. Maybe I should stop. I'm going on too long. Yeah. I'll stop.
No, Ted, I was gonna jump in. I think I forgot to mention that Janos has got to catch a train in a few hours, and he was begging us to allow him the possibility of dropping off a little early on the call so he could get some sleep. And
I cede the floor to Janos. Sorry, Janos. Sorry, all of you. I do go on.
well, here's my proposition. I'd like to ask Janos if perhaps he'd like to address the point that you made about his previous observation, and then we do a little Q&A, which could direct questions to Janos, and then we can come right back to your final remarks about feasible methods of governance, and then a full presentation from Ron Bayman and Q&A to complete the hour and a half. So if you would agree,
that sounds great. Absolutely.
Okay.
Let me just say before I mute that on most plausible mechanisms, I agree with everything that Janos said. And I probably agree with everything that he's about to say.
All right, that's good. But
be careful, Ben, because you don't know what I'm going to say.
So back to you, Janos.
It wasn't a binding commitment.
Yeah, if you'd like to react to Ted. Yeah, back to you.
Thank you, Dennis, and I appreciate it is getting no longer late, but early morning and so on. So thank you for that. But just quickly on Ted's comment on research governance, I think we agree, because the way I presented governance is not just about regulation; it's much broader than that. First of all. And secondly, the biggest problem I see with research right now is there's not enough research in this area. There needs to be a lot more. So part of governance is actually to encourage, by having resources, by talking about it, by encouraging the various science groups like the International Science Council, whoever, to actually pick up this issue and encourage their researchers to work on it. So a lot of the governance I'm talking about is actually about encouraging and making it happen. At the same time, I think it's also true that you need to have some guardrails, because even if those guardrails may not be very strict, the public expects that there be some level of guardrails around research, particularly the kind of research where a lot of public has some serious questions. So I think it needs to be looked at that way, and I think that if we look at it that way, then you and I probably agree on this, that the kind of governance that I was talking about. So then I don't know how you want to handle the questions in the chat.
Herb has been monitoring the chat, and I was just going to ask Herb if he might come in and particularly questions relevant to your remarks, Janos, so that you can drop off early. So over to you, Herb.
Thanks. And the first question is from our sort of honorary chief scientist, more than honorary, and wonderful colleague, Mike McCracken, who most of you know. And Mike's question is, would it make sense, and is it happening, to have a climate intervention considered as a necessity to meet the Sustainable Development Goals or similar follow-on, and have the UN Commission on Sustainable Development called upon by the Security Council to consider the issue and make a recommendation to both the Security Council and the General Assembly?
Very specific.
So the quick answer, well, the first part of the answer is yes, it would make sense in a perfect world. I totally agree. And in fact, we tried that approach in C2G early on, and guess what? We gave up because in a not so perfect world where we actually live, the Security Council is not operational anymore, and it is simply not able to address these kinds of issues for many reasons. We can go into the details, but a few years ago, there was a long process led by Germany to include climate security in the agenda of the Security Council, and eventually they managed. It did not include solar geoengineering or anything like that, but general climate security. But it was very difficult, and there were many countries who were opposing that because they felt that climate change shouldn't be addressed in the Security Council for many reasons. Now, that was the time when the Security Council was still sort of operational. It definitely isn't the case today, so I'm afraid we will miss that one, and we'll have to rely on other ways to encourage. I mean, since you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, and there was some chat as well, I think one of the problems is that Goal 13 on climate is like a Martian imported into Earth, and it's just simply not integral part of the other 17 or the other 16 goals. Yet we know that they are totally interlinked, and you cannot address climate without addressing poverty, without addressing the finance issues, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, it's more of a hard work to try to find a way in which the climate goal is not just as a silo put in the middle of the Sustainable Development Goals, but it really is done as part of all the others. So that would be my...
Very good.
Thank you. And I will ask you another question rather than Ted now, only because, again, you have to go. But if Ted wants to answer later on, obviously you're welcome to do that. And Thomas Tomic asks that you mentioned examples of good governance that do exist now. Could we hear more on these specifics?
Yeah, so there is not a lot because there's not that much activity, but I'd like to bring up two examples. The first one, I think what happened, I already alluded to this, the UNEP expert group and the report that they have produced. That to me was actually really quite something, because let's not forget that just before that, there was a draft resolution in the UN Environment Assembly asking UNEP to do something like that, and didn't succeed. And yet the executive director went ahead and did it anyway. Called an expert group, and they actually did essentially what was asked in the original draft resolution. And it became, they got the right experts, they produced a good report, it had a good follow-up. So I think that was an interesting and good example of the kind of governance that can happen in terms of the information exchange, public information, and also encouraging the different parts of the UN system to engage. Very different second example. Some of you may be aware of the Stardust startup that has started a commercial startup working on stratospheric aerosol injection. I was asked as an independent consultant to prepare a report for them on the governance implications. And, I'm not here to speak for Stardust. I cannot do that, and I won't do that. But my report is public. You can see it on my LinkedIn page if you're interested. What was remarkable is that they basically welcomed all those recommendations, and some of it they've already implemented, and others they plan to implement. Now, if they really do that, and there will be follow-up surely, then I would say they're doing pretty well. For a commercial startup to actually take on all those recommendations, I would say that's a good governance framework for a commercial startup to do. So those are the two examples perhaps I could share as good governance in this sense.
Well, thank you very much. And by the way, speaking of LinkedIn, I can't help but say that the book that I wrote a few years ago, A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, occasionally I'll post some of the terms of my book in LinkedIn. And Janos, if you remember a few months ago, you were my most reliable commenter and liker and so and I didn't. So anyway, it's a delight, and I thank you because sometimes you were the only one who liked what I wrote. So
well, I like that book. I have it right here.
Oh my goodness!
Right.
Dennis doesn't want me to turn this into a promotion for my book, but I appreciate that, Janos.
Well, yes. Let's see if Ted may have any feedback on these questions before we go on. Ted, would you want to say anything about the issues that we just addressed?
On Mike's question, I don't think I have anything to add to Janos's very thoughtful response.
Okay.
On examples of good governance, it depends on how broadly you search. I mean, it's out of fashion to refer to the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting chemicals as a salient and relevant example of international cooperation, but I think that's mistaken. I think there's it remains a striking success with high levels of cooperation that brought about a profound industrial and technological transformation that made huge environmental benefits, with the eventually enthusiastic cooperation of most of the major industrial actors in the space. And the last piece is so interesting and relevant because they didn't start out there. People have sort of forgotten. It's like the conduct of the major halocarbon manufacturers in the 1970s was just as nasty as the conduct of the fossil fuel industry in the 1990s. But then conditions changed and they changed, and courtesy and prudence both required that we all forget what they used to do and say and celebrate what they were now doing and saying. And there's a really powerful lesson in that. It's a difficult one where you're in the midst of a fight and you think people are acting dishonestly and badly and so on. So I always want to vote for the Montreal Protocol and the ozone, the ODS regime as a striking example of effective global governance.
Excellent point. Excellent. Herb, any other specific questions for Janos before we?
Yes. Yes, there's a question from.
Let him go to sleep.
That's right. One last. Pry your eyes open.
I need my nightcap before I can sleep.
Well, maybe one of these questions will stimulate you as much as whatever your nightcap would otherwise be. But we won't get into that. But I will ask the question from Robert Chris, who is a very active member, and speaking of books, I'll promote his book, Systems Thinking for Geoengineering Policy. Robert is smiling. We talked about it on our call this morning. His question is, to what extent is an emergency and/or an urgency framing relevant or helpful to governance?
Yeah, so I think it is, but one has to be careful about the words, because in fact we are in a global emergency in terms of the temperature overshoot. The problem is that people often think of emergency as happens today quickly. After a few days, the emergency is over. So this is not an emergency that is going to be over in 2 or 3 days. So we have to find a way to explain that the emergency is longer term, and it is in that context that we're talking about stratospheric aerosol injection. I often have the situation when I talk to people about, I'm no promoter of solar radiation modification as such. I'm a promoter of conversations about solar radiation modification. And when I raise the issue of SRM, they say, no, we need to reduce emissions. And that's not the same thing. And we have a temperature overshoot, and we need to be able to respond to that. And that is different, as Ted was saying, we're not reaching 1.5 by emission reductions alone, for sure. Good question if we can reach 2 or 2.5 with emission reductions alone. I don't think so. But these are the realities. So I think that the concept of we're in an emergency situation, we need action, and we need to consider the various actions that are available to us in that emergency. So I would say yes, just have to be careful with the words that we use.
Okay, let me ask one more question, if that's all right, Dennis, from
All right.
Robert. Robert, who is a member also of our steering circle. His question is, how clear is it that benefits of higher albedo far exceed risks? Benefits of mitigating risks of sea level rise, biodiversity loss, extreme weather, and systemic disruption. Main risk is the inability to agree on a governance mechanism.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert to make that judgment, but in our work during C2G, and I still believe this is very much so, we really have to be able to assess the risks of doing stratospheric aerosol injection versus the risks of not doing, both the quantifiable risks and the non-quantifiable risks, and do that in a way that society can come along with that. And it's not easy to do that, but that is the challenge. That is the hard part. Now, I've read many papers, I'm sure you have read them too. There are many interesting papers that tend to show that even in an overwhelming way, some of them, that the benefits will be much larger if one makes use of stratospheric aerosol injection. I don't think there is enough of those kinds of assessments to really help the public along yet, but that is the kind of studies and assessments that we will need to do in order to be able to move forward. And then eventually there will be an answer to that, one way or another.
Okay, I'm going to take my prerogative, and Dennis is probably going to cut me off, but I want to ask you one last question about us at HPAC. We're 3 years old. We're just starting a process of strategic planning to determine what direction we could take. There's so many we could. Dennis briefly read our mission statement. I'm going to just take 20 seconds to repeat a couple of the key items. And my question to you is, what we describe as our mission, is this something that you feel is an appropriate mission? Would you change it? I don't want to put you on the spot, but basically what we're saying, we advocate that the world community urgently come together to carry out an equitable science-based plan of action that includes what we call the climate triad: directly cooling the climate through sunshine reflection, ecosystem restoration, and other safe and effective means, accelerating emission reductions, and deploying large-scale removal of atmospheric carbon dioxide. The goal being not just to peak shave, but to reduce temperatures ultimately to well below 1 degree C. And later on, maybe we'll ask Ted that. But if we presented that to you and said, what do you think of that? Does that make sense?
My answer is yes, it would. It makes sense. And in fact, I myself said it in my remarks when I was talking about the UNFCCC, that at some point one has to bring these different elements together: the emission reductions, the adaptation, the resilience building, removals, and albedo management in some kind of integrated framework. So if you're addressing all of those as different parts of the strategy forward, then how could I say that that's not a good thing? It is a good thing, and it is great to have groups like yourselves who are active and who are trying to encourage this debate to happen. So I welcome that. There are others who have maybe slightly different ways, and they may not want to include all those 4 or 5 things that you've included. That's okay too. Let that discussion continue, but I think what you're trying to do makes a lot of sense.
Great. Back to Dennis.
Right. And just to top that off, it does occur to me that having you both gentlemen with us today is so exciting and so fruitful that we want to ensure that we can continue our dialogue with you as a means of advising us, as we develop our action plans in this domain. So we'll follow up with you on that for sure. It's such a special opportunity to have you with us. Right. Now, what I propose is that we proceed to the second segment of our program, which will feature Dr. Ron Bayman, who will share some key points on governance that's contained in the paper just published in the Oxford Open Climate Change on addressing the urgent need for direct climate cooling. And he will then make his remarks, and then we will go back to perhaps a short reaction from Ted on those remarks, and then open up the floor for further Q&A. So, Ron, the floor is yours. You have 8 minutes.
Okay, I'll put my timer on. Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you, Ted and Janos, for coming to speak to us. Let me share my my presentation. There we go, if that's okay. So there are a couple of things a few things I want to stress here. One is this is a paper that is forthcoming in Oxford Open Climate Change, addressing the urgent need for direct climate cooling rationale and options. And I think, Ted, I think it addresses exactly the kind of research that you were referring to in your remarks. But we'll see what you think. The first part is on the first slide addresses the triad that Herb talked about. So I want to try and get through this within the 8 minutes, so I will not spend more time on that. The second few slides, 3, 4, and 5, address a couple of tables in the paper that I think lay the foundation for some of what we say afterward regarding governance. So first of all, we did come up with 14 different direct climate cooling methods that we thought deserved further investigation. In some cases, they're actually being deployed at local levels and regional levels. And we distinguish between thermal radiation management and solar radiation management. So I know the nomenclature of SRM goes at least as far back as the NASIM, the National Academy of Science report, where they include SAI, MCB, and cirrus cloud thinning as SRM. And of course, we have one of the major cirrus cloud thinning folks in our group, David Mitchell, and he concurred that cirrus cloud thinning is actually TRM. It's thermal radiation management because you're letting heat out. And when you do that, you open up the space. And we thought it was useful, therefore, to call these approaches direct climate cooling because they're actually much broader than SRM. That is, in any case, already misleadingly applied to techniques like CCT and then mixed cloud thinning and other things like that. So the next couple of slides address our attempts to assess which direct climate cooling approaches were most likely to scale up to have a global impact in the next 10 or 20 years. And that's because we are very concerned about the urgency of this need. And we came up with 3. I don't want to, these slides are much too much to go through in 8 minutes, but we came up with 3 approaches that we thought were most likely to scale up to a global scale. Our reviewers pushed us very hard on these questions. One is, of course, stratospheric aerosol injection that we've been talking about. The second would be marine cloud brightening. And the third we thought was tropospheric. We called it tropospheric aerosol injection, but it's basically tropospheric aerosols attempt to create benign tropospheric aerosols to cool the planet, perhaps to substitute for phosphate tropospheric aerosols that, as we know, have been reduced due to the International Maritime Organization's recent regulations. So the rest of the presentation, the next 7 slides, address some of the various key points in the governance section of our paper. And some of them, I think, Ted and Janos, I guess Janos is no longer with us, but I assume that you might agree with many of these points. So I can, I don't think I need to spend a great deal of time on them. We had a recent discussion about the the AMOC, Wake Smith sent out a couple of papers that some of you may have seen and discussed them on a podcast with the reviewer too, does geoengineering with Andrew Lockley. And he stresses that Wake Smith stresses that the AMOC there's now indications that it may collapse this century, and that and I was listening to a discussion by Romsdorf recently, who's one of the major tipping experts, that was also sent out on the HPEC Google group list by Chris Vivian, and he also stresses that there, at least there are many different papers that do suggest that we may have a tipping point very soon. So, or much sooner than is previously suggested. In fact, he says, there are at least. Anyway, I'm going astray here, but so that's
3 minutes left.
Yeah. Okay. So let me. So we suggest that waiting for governance will be too late, and we have, we're quite concerned about that because we have an urgent need for cooling. So in many cases, national and local. So those techniques that are just locally scalable can start, right now. And we have examples of, trying to use mirrors to reduce some of the heat in Africa, and other folks working in the Himalayas trying to protect some of the glaciers with a similar surface albedo management. So and in many cases there are local jurisdictions that can deal with that. Including the MCB effort in Australia and the Great Barrier Reef, that is basically an attempt to reduce the peak heating events over the coral reefs to save the reefs, and it's very unlikely to have effects in other parts of the world. Now, the really interesting piece, I think, in our paper, and it leads to something that Janos has talked about, is the notion is how to get started with SAI. If we think that this is actually one of the more promising approaches, one of the proposals in our paper is that we could use a kind of International Space Station model and a Save the Great Barrier Reef model, put them together and say, we want to save the polar regions, and we need to do both poles for symmetry. So this would be perhaps what Keith and Smith, again, in a recent article and paper, have actually talked about this, not exactly the space station model, but talked about subscale deployment of SAI that would really be kind of confined to a local region. And of course, the polar regions is where you could do that because it comes down in the poles. The troposphere the tropopause is lower, so you can actually get existing planes up to the troposphere. And as it turns out, Wake Smith and co-authors have recently authored 2 papers that actually discuss in detail how to do this in the next 20 years, to build a fire extinguisher to avert near-term tipping points, and particularly Smith is concerned about the AMOC, as Romsdorf is as well. And so the idea here is you get a coalition of willing, perhaps.
Ron, we're out of time. Would you like to make?
I'm out of time. Okay, so that is one of the more interesting proposals. But I invite people to read our paper and look at all these various different elements to complete our discussion of governance and coordination and deployment. We believe should work together, should evolve together, are likely to evolve together. So we really can't just wait for governance to happen before we start deployment. I think it links to what Ted talked about. Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So thank you very much. And
exactly. Thank you, Ron. And we'll carry on with this. I think this discussion has been so rich. we must immediately begin thinking of having another session on this topic in the very near future. So we'll work on that. Now, I'd like to come back to Ted. I know I cut you off a bit early in lieu of Janos's need to leave, but I'd like to ask you if you'd like to perhaps finish up what you were saying about governance mechanisms, feasible governance mechanisms, and you could, of course, react to what Ron has just presented as well. So, Ted, floor is yours.
Yeah, happy to do that, and of course, completely appropriate to cut me off for Janos's need. I didn't realize that he was back in Europe, and so it was so late for him. I'm going to have to be quick too, because I have to ring off in about 5 or 7 minutes. So let me very quickly address a couple of the interesting questions that came up addressed to Janos. First, there was one question: is there really evidence that the benefits of albedo modification, in particular stratospheric aerosol, exceed the risk? The answer is no, there can't be authoritative evidence. We always have remaining uncertainties and don't know. But this is a case in which the broad thrust of 15 or 20 years of research is surprisingly uniform and surprisingly favorable. There are now between 100 and 200 climate model studies done of SAI interventions. Many of them done by people whose intention was to prove that it couldn't work or that it'd be trouble. And the results uniformly have been to show, wow, it even though it's a different mechanism that doesn't fully offset the effects of infrared heating from elevated greenhouse gases, the climate restoration while it's operating is surprisingly good. The distribution of benefits worldwide is shockingly uniform, to the extent that there's special benefits to one region, it's to the most vulnerable and low-income, low-latitude countries. And the identified harmful side effects, which are kind of obvious and were identified even before these studies started, look surprisingly modest relative to the risks avoided and surprisingly mitigable. Now, you can't take that to the bank, but that's a shockingly kind of uniform and consistent pattern from a body of early research. So it looks really promising. It does depend on how it's used. So the focus on governance and control of deployment is completely appropriate, because even all these studies, they're trying to make it work well for human welfare and the environment. They're using deployment scenarios that are optimized for global benefit. So they don't tell you much about how bad it could be if somebody tried to push in the wrong direction. But the evidence is surprisingly favorable, and the natural analogs on which it's based put a sort of a loose boundary upon how bad it could be. When you have volcanoes putting 10 million tons into the stratosphere, most recently in 1991, and hardly anybody except scientists really noticed in the interannual variability, it's not authoritative, but it gives you some comfort about how bad it can be. So, second, emergency framing. This is so hard. In my public talks on this, I often describe climate change as a train wreck happening in slow motion. I try to give people kind of the cinematic visual image of, like, it's moving slowly, but don't imagine that means you could just push and stop it, right? Emergency responses or emergency framing, as Janos suggested, are dangerous because they can be used to justify any suspension of normal order, normal rules, normal considerations of other societal concerns, justice, procedural justice, and so on. And climate change is different. It is a train wreck happening in slow motion. So it's an emergency that no one will solve by a single decisive action or 10 years of decisive action. And I don't know that anybody has any idea how to sustain a collective imperative on a kind of a survival-threatening need for continued effort that lasts 5 generations. And in particular, how to do that in a way that sustains a decent society, that kind of preserves alternative life paths and prosperity and liberality and, ways for people to, mind their own affairs and pursue their different life aims. Liberal democracy is good. You don't want to blow it over. I mean, maybe you have to. It's like, if the spaceship is crashing, then I guess you need military control, but not forever and in all respects. So I don't have a good answer to that. The last question I want to address, your mission statement. It's terrific. There's issues of nuance of language and order of presentation and stuff. You are intentionally provocative by putting the interventions first. Most people who argue for those, sort of, gesture immediately toward, the need to cut emissions. It's an interesting choice that you haven't. I'd say two things. One, big social change happens through trusted social networks. So I don't know if you folks belong to PTAs or churches or labor unions or bird watching clubs or community choirs, but you need to find a way to leverage your own individual and group scale credibility and trust among all relevant social networks so this spreads out. And two, your program is abstract. It says what humanity should do. You need to translate it into concrete, feasible political actions by identified actors that have current legitimate authorities so that you can go to people and say, Madam Mayor, Madam Councilor, Mr. Minister, Mr. Vice President, Mr. Senator, Madam Congresswoman, here's what we want you to do. Because nobody acts at the level of abstraction that we're talking about today. And with that, actually, unless there's sort of an urgent rejoinder, what, here, at some universities, they call a two-finger, I'm going to have to excuse myself and run. And thank you. Thank you for your group and what you're doing and your mission and for the opportunity to speak with you.
Well, thank you, Ted, for joining us. It's just been a terrific discussion, and we will release you to get on to your next appointment in 5 minutes or so. But we'll hold on the group to recap and wrap up our discussions, even though you may just need to drop off now, and do so whenever you find it necessary. And we'll carry on organizing how we address your latest challenge, which is we've got to start asking people what exactly they need to do to support this agenda. Very, very well said. A very good way of coming to the end of our program today. So thank you very, very much.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Ted. Hope we can see you again soon.
We will see you again soon. Yeah. All right. Well, our group still has about 27 people, and I think that probably Herb has a number of other questions that we're not able to come up. What I could do is work with Herb to assemble those questions into a communication to both of our special guests, and from what I can see, they will be very happy to get back to us with the responses to those questions, and in the process, continue our dialogue with them. And as I said, I think we've got to start a schedule for another governance session in the very near future as well. But let me open up the floor for your comments on the session, your reactions and suggestions on how we go forward from here. Anyone coming online, just raise your hand in the chat, and we'll recognize as we go. Yeah.
I just wanted, Dennis, if I could, I just wanted to elaborate for a minute on what you said about follow-up. As some of you know, what we've attempted and are doing this fall is we've developed a series of 8 programs on various issues, of which this is our 3rd. And our goal in the program is to not have these sessions as one-off sessions where we all feel good. We had a great discussion or not so good, and then we forget about it and go on to the next one. So what we'd like to do, and either today in the chat or by email with us or otherwise, is if any of you are interested in continuing not only the discussion, but our analysis of governance and how it advances our mission statement, that may take the form of additional sessions, as Dennis suggested. It may take the form of a couple people wanting to write a white paper. It may take the form of integrating governance into future sessions that don't have that as the main topic, or anything else. But we don't want this conversation to end after today and we move on to something else as if it never happened. So that's our ask of you all, whether you're a member of or you're on our list or here as a guest, doesn't really matter. Get involved, give us your, and if you have an idea, but you don't want to work on it, that's fine too. Give us your idea. So I'll turn it back to you, Dennis.
Very good, very good. And in fact, Herb, since I'm a little distracted, maybe you could put your email address into the chat so that anyone who is online and would like to follow up to get on our mailing list can communicate with you, and we can do that. One idea that was hatching in my mind as a result of this session today was the prospect of continuing our work in this area by establishing an HPAC Cooling Interventions Governance Working Group. We have a number of working groups, such as our U.S. Government Influencing Group and a number of others, but we haven't talked about a Cooling Interventions Governance Working Group, which could mobilize our efforts along the lines that you mentioned, Herb, in doing policy briefs, white papers, and advocacy activities with relevant government agencies at different levels. And so I'm going to put that on the table for consideration by our steering group, steering circle, and perhaps that could be a way of sustaining our work in this area, because this is just the first of a major set of conversations and action. So let's see, who is next on the? I think Brian had his hand up next, and then Ron.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention briefly that thanks to the suggestion of Andrew Lockley, we managed to get an abstract into the Cambridge issue, our proposed issue on climate intervention governance. That'll be due at the end of this year, but it'll be an interesting opportunity, and those who wish to help bake the cake welcome their input on local and regional interventions that are hopefully specific, measurable, actionable, smart interventions such as Ted suggested. Thank you.
Oh, that's a very relevant comment, Brian, and we'll follow up with that and keep our members informed how they can contribute to that. Thank you so much. And on to Ron.
Oh, thank you, Dennis. I'm sorry for. I realize I had more time to talk than most others here, but everyone else here, I guess. But I'm wondering. I think it was the issue, as I see, the reason I was thinking of asking Janos, what he meant by a unilateral intervention. The trying to get to the Overton window here. I think they were both very good. I think they are very sympathetic to what we're trying to do. But I would have liked to sort of, try and kind of push them a little bit on this reticence to talk about deployment, somehow. And I think Janos actually, by saying, he understood unilateral action would be a possibility. And I know, Dennis, you picked up on that as well. That was a real opening, I thought. And I was kind of, it's too bad that he had to leave early, but, because it really is not so unilateral in my mind. If as the Smith and Keith paper outline, you have actual local jurisdiction. You do subscale at a local jurisdiction. You have governmental jurisdiction. So, it's in that sense, it might pass international legal scrutiny, but these are the kind of things I was hoping we might be able to get to, but we only have so much time. Thank you.
Well, at least the stratospheric ones, they have global repercussions. So I think for some of the local tropospheric interventions, you can make a case for local and regional. Stratospheric ones may be harder unless they're latitudinally determined, like the
in the paper, Brian, or the article, they actually outline a subscale that they claim, Keith and Smith, that would largely be confined. It was, and I was thinking the poles in particular, because it falls down very quickly, and it would be on the order of 100 kilotons, like 100 kilotons, metric tons. rather than the gigatons that we talk about normally with SAI. So anyway, that's, a technical question, but apparently, I was kind of surprised, but they claim that it could be, at least to start with, a kind of a local program.
So Dennis, I don't know whether, hello, Dennis.
Yes, go ahead, Rebecca.
We're now past our general meeting time, and I'm happy to respond to what Ron said, but if people need to go and we stay on as the steering circle, that's fine. But what I heard, Ron, is that they're both in favour of what local deployment. You need to first work out the science, and I don't think that either SAI, MCB or TAI have been developed and tested locally yet, which is the first step in getting anything done. And secondly, they both emphasise trust, and Ted was emphasising we. And so I'm saying that if you're a person living in the poles, you're part of the very local we. And it was a wonderful, sophisticated discussion about David Hume and so forth. I wonder what First Nations philosophers would think of David Hume, etc. But I actually think they were both, they recognise the urgency, and they're on the same path as us, except that they're not saying it. And anyone like Wake Smith, who is saying polar intervention on both poles, or we're saying both poles, I'm sure he does recognise that there are local impacts up there and the local communities need to have trust and so on and so forth. But I didn't think it was inconsistent at all. They just didn't say it, just like you didn't get a chance to mention MCB trials because you ran out of time. So anyway, I didn't think it was I thought it was more a matter of time rather than that they're on a different planet from us.
Yep. Very good, Rebecca. Thank you. I don't see any other hands up.
I think Mike has his hand up.
Oh, Mike, yes, please go ahead, Mike.
I only wanted to mention that there was a very interesting National Academy briefing today on the new report that came out about potential for methane removal and whether it would work and what they do. And they sort of propose a 3 to 5 year research program to get at some of the questions, but they considered a range of possible kind of things. It's basically, it seemed that it's sort of too dilute a concentration to get concentrators and other things to get it out. And then they had whether ecosystems could do it and whether surface coatings could catalyze destruction. And then they had this issue of injecting materials into the troposphere, which is sort of, Peterson was on, he asked a question or posed a question, so I know it, but it is an interesting possibility. It wasn't sort of in the list of the 3 that